The day my grandmother passed away was a day I'll never forget. I had always known she was old, well into her 80s, but the news of her death still hit me harder than I expected. Grandma had lived a full, rich life. She had seen so much of the world, witnessed history unfold, and had a personality that could light up a room. But despite all of her accomplishments, she never seemed to be in a rush to go anywhere. We had been close growing up, but as time passed, I had seen less of her. Life got in the way. There was school, then work, then my own family. But every time I visited her, I was reminded of what a steady, dependable presence she was in my life. Her stories of our ancestors, of the house she had grown up in, and of our family's past always fascinated me. It felt like I could never really leave her house, even when I had to. When I got the call from the lawyer about the reading of her will, I wasn't sure what to expect. I thought it would be a typical situation. Grandma would leave something small, something sentimental. A few old books, a couple of antique pieces, perhaps. I imagined she would leave most of her savings to charity, as she had always talked about doing. But nothing could have prepared me for what came next. It was a chilly afternoon when I walked into the lawyer's office, and I could already tell something was off. The room was dim, lit by a soft desk lamp that cast shadows over the walls. I wasn't alone. My parents were there, seated on the opposite side of the desk, their faces grim. There was something tense about the atmosphere, like there was a... The lawyer, a middle-aged man with glasses perched at the tip of his nose, cleared his throat and opened a folder on the desk. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable, before speaking. "Your grandmother, as you know, was very particular about how she wanted her estate handled. She left detailed instructions for how she wanted her belongings distributed, including her home." I nodded, unsure where this was going. My parents exchanged a glance, their faces unreadable. "She left the mansion, the entire estate, to you." I felt my chest tighten. What? The words didn't quite register at first. "The mansion is yours, as per your grandmother's wishes." I could feel my heart race as I processed what I'd just heard. I had always known that Grandma loved her home, the sprawling Victorian house that had been in our family for generations. It had once been a vibrant hub of family life, with parties and gatherings and endless laughter. But over the years, as her health declined, the house had become quieter, more solitary. Still, the idea of inheriting it, of taking on such a massive responsibility, was overwhelming. My parents didn't react immediately. It was only when the lawyer continued reading through the rest of the will that I saw their expressions shift. They seemed surprised, but there was something else there, something more calculated. It didn't take long for the lawyer to finish. The rest of the will was relatively simple. A few small items to be passed down to my cousins, some money for charity, and a few personal possessions for friends. But the mansion, inheritance, was the centerpiece. When the lawyer finished, he glanced at my parents before turning his attention back to me. "There is one more thing," he said, as if bracing himself for something. "Your grandmother did leave a letter for you as well. She wanted to make sure that you understood her reasoning." I felt a wave of unease settle over me. My parents were looking at me differently now. They hadn't said a word during the reading of the will, but their silence spoke volumes. The lawyer handed me the letter. It was sealed with an elegant wax stamp, just like the letters Grandma had written me over the years. I carefully opened it, my fingers trembling slightly as I unfolded the paper inside. "If you are reading this, then I am no longer with you. I know this might come as a surprise, but I trust that you will understand why I made this decision. I have watched you grow over the years, and I have seen how you carry yourself, how you value family, heritage, and tradition. You are the only one of my grandchildren who truly understands the significance of the mansion and its place in our family's history. Your parents, as much as I love them, have never shown the same respect for the house or the memories it holds. This house is more than just a building. It is a legacy, a reflection of all those who came before us, It is the heart of our family. I can think of no one better to care for it than you. But I ask this, please do not let it become a burden. If you ever feel overwhelmed, know that you have the power to make the right decision. This mansion should bring you peace, not stress. I love you deeply, and I hope that you will honor my wishes. With all my love, Grandma. The letter was simple, heartfelt, and yet its weight was immense. It felt like she had entrusted me with something irreplaceable. As I folded it back up and placed it carefully on the table, I looked up at my parents, who were now watching me with expressions I couldn't quite decipher. "You've got to be kidding me," my father finally said, breaking the silence. "This is absurd." My mother's face was tight with frustration, though she said nothing. Instead, she simply stared at the letter, her eyes narrowing as if she were trying to understand how this could have happened. "Mom and I had always assumed that one of us would inherit the house," my father continued. "It's been in the family for generations. Why would she give it to you? You're not prepared for something like this." I felt a lump form in my throat. I didn't want to argue with my parents, but this wasn't something I had asked for. I hadn't even thought about the possibility of inheriting the mansion. It had always felt like something so far removed from my everyday life, but now it was mine, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. "I didn't choose this," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's what Grandma wanted. She made her decision clear." "Clear?" My father's voice rose. She was practically blind in her last few years. How could she make such a monumental decision when she couldn't even take care of herself? I recoiled at the harshness in his tone. This wasn't the father I knew. His voice, usually calm and measured, was now laced with anger and resentment. "You don't know what she went through at the end," I replied, my voice firm. "She knew what she was doing." My mother finally spoke, her voice quieter but no less strained. "You have to understand, this house is a huge responsibility. The maintenance alone will be expensive. And what about the bills, the property taxes? We don't have the resources to help you with that. This could ruin you." I looked at them, feeling a mix of sadness and confusion. They had never seemed particularly interested in the mansion before, and now they were acting as if it was theirs by right. My mother's words were grounded in practicality, and I understood that. The mansion was expensive to maintain, the upkeep would be relentless, but it felt wrong, the way they were speaking, as if this was something that should have been theirs all along. "I'll figure it out," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Grandma left it to me. I'm not going to sell it or give it away just because you think it's too much." The tension in the room thickened. My parents didn't say anything else, but their disapproval hung heavy in the air. As I walked out of the lawyer's office, the weight of Grandma's decision pressed on me. I wasn't sure if I was ready for this, but there was no turning back now. The mansion was mine, and I was determined to honor her wishes, no matter what. The days following the reading of Grandma's will felt like a blur, a storm of conflicting emotions and responsibilities that left me reeling. I was still adjusting to the idea that the mansion was now mine. A beautiful old Victorian house set on a sprawling piece of land, the mansion had always been a place of nostalgia for me. I remembered summers spent there as a child, running through the garden with my cousins, playing hide-and-seek in the grand, echoing hallways, and spending hours in the library surrounded by dusty old books. But now, standing at the threshold of the house that was once full of life, it felt heavy, almost suffocating. It was no longer a summer escape or a family gathering spot. It was mine, and the weight of that responsibility was starting to sink in. I had visited the mansion a few times since Grandma's passing, mostly to check on things. I had been overwhelmed with the idea of upkeep. Maintaining a house this large was no small feat. The lawn alone was a vast expanse that needed constant attention, and the house itself seemed to require repairs at every turn. The roof had leaks, the plumbing was outdated, and the heating system was barely functional. The mansion was beautiful, but it was also old, worn down by time. I knew I had a monumental task ahead of me if I was to preserve it in any way close to how Grandma had kept it. But what hit me hardest in those first few days wasn't the responsibility of maintaining the house. It was the way my parents had started to act. Their behavior, subtle at first, began to shift from concern to something far less innocent. They had always been practical people, and in many ways their concern for me was genuine. But as I continued to take steps to get the mansion in order, it became clear that they weren't just concerned for my well-being. They were calculating. They were looking at the mansion not as a family legacy, but as a financial asset, a way out of their own personal struggles. It started with the phone calls. They'd check in with me daily, asking about the house, how I was handling everything, if I was managing the expenses. At first, I appreciated their concern, but soon their questions became more pointed. My father, who had always been a numbers guy, began asking me about the estate's value, the potential for selling it, the cost of repairs, and what I planned to do with the property in the long run. At first, I brushed it off as idle curiosity, but as the weeks went by, his tone became increasingly insistent. "Are you sure you can afford all of this?" he asked one evening, his voice tense over the phone. "The taxes alone are astronomical, and the upkeep. How do you plan to manage?" "I'll figure it out," I replied, trying to sound confident. Grandma made sure everything was in order. "The house has been in the family for generations. I'm not going to sell it." My father didn't respond right away. Then, almost casually, he added, "Well, it's not like you can live there forever. It's a lot of house for one person. Have you thought about maybe selling it? You could use the money, pay off any debts, start fresh." I felt a knot form in my stomach. It wasn't the first time he'd mentioned selling the mansion, but this time it felt more deliberate, more pressing. It was as if he was planting a seed, waiting for me to consider it, to entertain the idea. "No," I said firmly. "I'm not selling." "All right," he said, his voice softening. "I just want what's best for you. I'm sure Grandma would have wanted you to make the best decision for yourself." I didn't want to get into an argument, so I let it go. But the conversation lingered in my mind long after the phone call ended. It was the beginning of a pattern. Subtle nudges, gentle suggestions, all leading in one direction: selling the mansion. I could tell my father wasn't concerned about me or the house. He was concerned about the money. A few days later, my mother visited. I hadn't seen her in a while, and I was looking forward to spending some time together. She had always been a calming presence in my life, the kind of person who would sit with you in silence and make everything feel okay. But when she arrived at the mansion, I noticed something was different. She didn't seem excited to be there. Instead, her eyes scanned the house with a look of concern, and her lips were pressed tightly together as if she was holding something back. "Is everything okay, Mom?" I asked, trying to gauge her mood. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked into the living room and began examining the old furniture, running her fingers over the armrests, inspecting the cracks in the wood. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "This house isn't practical for you, right?" she said. "It's so much to maintain, and you're on your own. It's not like you have a family to fill it. It's a burden, and I'm not sure it's worth the stress." I tried not to let her words get to me, but they stung. "I'm not worried about the house being practical," I replied. "It's family history, Mom. It's something important." She turned to look at me, her face softening, but her eyes still held that edge of concern. "I understand that, sweetie, but sometimes you have to be realistic. You can't carry the weight of this place alone, and with everything going on in the world, your job, your personal life, it might be time to think about what's best for you." Her words were coated with the same undertone I had heard from my father. What's best for me seemed to translate into what's easiest for them. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. My parents weren't just worried about me, they were worried about themselves. They were concerned that the mansion, in all its grandeur, might become a financial burden that they couldn't escape. That evening, my father called again. This time, his tone was more direct. "You really should consider selling," he said, without any preamble. "We've been through a lot, and this house could make a real difference in helping us get back on our feet." You're not in a position to keep it, not with the way things are." I tried to keep my voice steady. "What do you mean, the way things are?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew the answer. "You know exactly what I mean," he snapped. "The debt we've been carrying, the bills we can't pay. The house is worth millions and you're sitting on a gold mine. You could sell it, pay off everything, and still have enough left to live comfortably. Why keep something that's just going to drag you down?" The words hit me like a slap in the face. I had known that my parents were struggling financially, but I had never realized the extent of it. They had always tried to shield me from their problems, but now it was clear they had their eyes set on the mansion as a solution to their own issues. The mansion was no longer something sacred, it was a means to an end, a potential source of wealth. "I'm not selling it," I said, my voice firmer this time. "Grandma left it to me for a reason. I'm not going to just give it up." My father didn't respond immediately. For a moment, there was only silence on the other end of the line. Then he spoke again, his voice cold and calculated. "Fine," he said, "but don't come crying to me when it all falls apart. You'll see. This house, it's not the blessing you think it is." The conversation ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the phone in my hand, a mixture of frustration and disbelief swirling in my chest. I had never felt so alone, so isolated. My parents weren't offering support, they were offering pressure. They didn't care about the history of the house or my feelings, they only cared about the money. Over the next few days, the pressure intensified. My parents started showing up unannounced, subtly questioning every decision I made regarding the house. They would suggest that I hire a contractor to assess the property, even though I hadn't yet made any decisions about repairs. They made vague comments about how it would be so much easier if someone with experience took over, and how things would be much better for everyone if I just let go of the house. It was clear they had one goal in mind, convincing me to sell. But the more they pressured me, the more resolute I became. Grandma had entrusted me with the mansion, and I wasn't going to let it slip through my fingers because of their greed and desperation. But the tension was mounting. I could feel it every time I saw them, every time they called or visited. They were no longer the parents I had grown up with. They were strangers, people who saw the mansion as a way to solve their own financial woes, and I began to wonder how far they would go to get what they wanted. Would they go so far as to challenge the will itself? Would they try to take the mansion from me, legally if not physically? It was clear that this wasn't just about the house. It was about something deeper, something that had been brewing beneath the surface for years. The mansion had become a symbol of everything that was wrong between us. My parents were no longer my parents. They were adversaries, and the battle for Grandma's legacy had only just begun. It was around 2 months after Grandma's passing when I first noticed a real shift. Up until then, my parents' behavior had been uncomfortable, but still indirect. They had approached the mansion as something I had inherited out of obligation rather than joy, suggesting again and again that it would be better for me to sell it. But after a few weeks of my firm refusal, things escalated. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I came home to find a letter from a law firm waiting for me. The envelope was thick and formal-looking, sealed with the kind of precision I had seen only in corporate or legal correspondence. At first, I assumed it was another one of the endless papers I had been sorting through since Grandma's passing, possibly related to her estate or tax documents. But as I opened it, my heart sank. The letter was from the law firm representing my parents, and its contents were clear. They were contesting the will. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My parents weren't just trying to pressure me into selling, they were taking legal action, and they wanted to strip me of my inheritance altogether. They claimed that Grandma was of unsound mind when she wrote the will, and that I, as her beneficiary, had undue influence over her final decisions. The letters stated that they were prepared to fight the will in court, claiming that I had manipulated Grandma into leaving me the mansion. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the letter, my hands shaking. The emotional toll was hard enough to bear, But now I was facing the very real threat of a legal battle. My parents had already started their crusade to undermine Grandma's wishes, and I wasn't sure how to defend myself. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about everything that had been fractured in our family. Everything that had been left unsaid over the years. It was as if they had decided that whatever loyalty I had once had to them, whatever respect I had for them as parents, was suddenly irrelevant. I didn't want to fight my parents. I didn't want to be in opposition to them. But I also knew that if I didn't stand my ground, everything Grandma had left behind would be lost. The mansion wasn't just property, it was a symbol of family history. It was where I had grown up, where my childhood had unfolded. It was a tangible connection to all the generations before me, and it felt like the last thread connecting me to a past that was quickly slipping away. The first step in this legal battle was a meeting with my lawyer. He was an older man named Richard, who had handled a few minor estate matters for my family over the years. Richard had known Grandma in her later years, and I hoped that his knowledge of her character and the family history would be enough to help me fight this. We met at his office, a small, cluttered space, with bookshelves lined with thick legal tomes and a long wooden desk covered in papers. He looked over the letter from my parents' lawyer carefully, his brow furrowed. "Well," Richard said after a long pause, "this isn't exactly uncommon, but it certainly isn't easy. They're claiming that your grandmother wasn't of sound mind when she wrote the will, and they're suggesting that you had some kind of influence over her decision-making. It's going to be a tough fight." I nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle even more heavily on my shoulders. I didn't have the resources to fight a drawn-out legal battle, and the thought of going to court against my own parents was excruciating. "They're saying I manipulated her," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "that I somehow pressured her into giving me the mansion." Richard didn't look at me for a moment, staring instead at the letter in his hand. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "It's a common tactic. If they can prove that you had undue influence over your grandmother, they can argue that the will isn't valid. But the burden of proof is on them. It's not going to be easy for them to show that you manipulated her, especially since she was of sound mind when she made the decision." "But how can I prove that?" I asked, the desperation creeping into my voice. "I'm not even sure how to fight something like this. It's my word against theirs." Richard leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "The best thing you can do right now is gather evidence of your relationship with your grandmother. If you can show that your bond with her was close, that she made this decision independently, it will work in your favor. Do you have any letters, emails, or other correspondence that might demonstrate the nature of your relationship?" I nodded, remembering the many letters Grandma had written to me over the years. She had always been a prolific writer, sending me letters filled with love, advice, and stories about our family. There were also photos of us together at family events, photos of her in the mansion, with me by her side, looking so much younger. "That's a good place to start," Richard said, "but you'll also need witnesses. If anyone can testify that your grandmother was of sound mind when she made the will, that will help strengthen your case. Do you have anyone who was close to her in her final years?" I thought for a moment, and then a name popped into my head. Claire, Grandma's best friend from the neighborhood, had known her for decades. She had visited often, especially in the last years of Grandma's life, when she was no longer able to go out much. Claire was someone who had seen Grandma at her most lucid, and I could recall many times when she had expressed her admiration for the way Grandma had managed everything herself, even in her old age. "I think Claire could help," I said slowly. "She saw Grandma every week. She would know what state her mind was in." "That's a start," Richard said with a nod. "I'll draft a letter to Claire asking her to testify, and we'll start gathering whatever documentation we can. We'll need to show the court that Grandma's decision was made independently, without any pressure from you." Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into gathering evidence to support my case. I went through old photos, sifted through boxes of letters and personal documents from Grandma, and reached out to people who had known her in her final years. Claire agreed to testify on my behalf, as did a few of Grandma's other friends and neighbors who had witnessed her daily life. I also gathered financial records to show that Grandma had not been under any financial duress at the time she made the will. The more I pieced together, the more confident I felt, though the anxiety never fully dissipated. I was in a battle, and there was no telling how it would end. Meanwhile, my parents continued to press. Every few days I would receive another letter from their lawyer, each one more aggressive than the last. They were demanding that I sell the mansion immediately, threatening to take me to court over the will's validity if I didn't comply. They insisted that Grandma had been senile in her last years and that her decision to leave me the house was made under duress. They even went so far as to claim that I had used manipulative tactics to convince her to leave me everything. The letters were painful to read. Each one felt like another reminder of the deepening rift between us. My parents were no longer concerned about my well-being. They were focused solely on the mansion. It was as though they had already made up their minds that I was unworthy of it, and they would do whatever it took to take it from me. Finally, the day came when the case was officially filed. The court date was set, and the legal proceedings began in earnest. I couldn't avoid the reality anymore. I was about to go head-to-head with my parents in a legal battle that threatened to tear apart whatever was left of our family. The tension was unbearable, and I had never felt so isolated. The night before the court proceedings began, I sat in the mansion's vast living room, the echo of my own thoughts bouncing off the walls. I hadn't expected things to turn out like this. The mansion, which had once been a place of warmth and laughter, had become a battleground. My parents, the people I had trusted most in the world, were now my adversaries. The weight of it all pressed on me, but there was no turning back. I knew what I had to do. Grandma's wishes had been clear. She had trusted me with the mansion, and I was not going to let it slip away. But as I prepared to face my parents in court, I realized that the true battle was not just for the house. It was for my own sense of identity, my place in this fractured family, and my ability to honor the legacy that Grandma had left me. I didn't just want the mansion. I wanted to prove that I could keep it, that I could uphold the values it represented, no matter the cost. And if that meant going to court, then that's exactly what I would do. The morning of the court hearing was cold and gray, as if the weather itself reflected the weight of the situation I was about to face. The mansion, usually a sanctuary for me, now felt like a prison. Every room seemed to echo with the ghost of past arguments, whispered promises, and forgotten love. As I stood in the entrance hall, my eyes lingered on the familiar walls, the paintings of ancestors that had watched over generations of our family. I felt as though I were looking at the last remnants of a time that was quickly slipping away, and I couldn't help but wonder what Grandma would have thought of everything that had unfolded. The courtroom, too, felt strange. It was a place I had never imagined I would need to step into, much less to battle my own parents over something so personal, so deeply tied to our shared history. The air was thick with tension as my lawyer, Richard, and I entered the court, walking past the rows of empty seats that would soon be filled with onlookers. My parents were already there, sitting together on one side of the room, their faces grim and determined. They were prepared for this fight, and I could see it in the way they sat, side by side like a united front. My father had always been the strategist, the one who made plans and executed them with military precision. My mother, on the other hand, had always been the emotional one, but today she was silent, her face set in an expression I had never seen before, cold and unreadable. My heart hammered in my chest as we took our seats. The tension in the room was palpable. The court proceedings began with the judge introducing himself and outlining the purpose of the hearing, to resolve the dispute over the validity of my grandmother's will. My parents' lawyer, a tall man with sharp features and an air of arrogance, stood up first. He spoke with confidence, outlining their argument that Grandma had been of unsound mind when she made the will, claiming that my influence had led her to make a decision that she would not have made otherwise. He painted a picture of a vulnerable, aging woman who had been taken advantage of, manipulated into leaving her most valuable possession to her granddaughter. His words felt like daggers, and I had to fight to keep my composure. The accusations were false, of course, but the way he spoke made it sound so convincing, as though I had truly done something wrong. I could see my parents nodding in agreement with his words, their expressions firm. It felt as though I were already being condemned in their eyes. The mansion, which had been a place of refuge and warmth, now felt like a battleground, and I was alone, my back against the wall. Then it was my turn. Richard stood and addressed the court, presenting our case. He argued that the will had been written when Grandma was in full possession of her faculties, and that there was no evidence to suggest she had been coerced or manipulated. He called upon witnesses, starting with Claire, Grandma's close friend. Claire was a frail woman now, her hair thin and white, but her eyes were sharp, and she spoke with a clarity that belied her years. "I visited Margaret every week," Claire testified, her voice steady. "We talked about many things, including her will. She was adamant about her decision to leave the house to her granddaughter. There was no sign of confusion or any indication that she wasn't of sound mind. She knew exactly what she was doing." Her words were like a balm to my frayed nerves. Claire had been with Grandma in her final years, and if anyone could testify to her mental state, it was her. Other witnesses came forward, all friends and neighbors who had known Grandma in her later years. Each one confirmed that she was independent, sharp, and fully aware of her decisions, including the decision to leave the mansion to me. The evidence mounted, but I could feel my parents' lawyer growing more frustrated. They had no real case, they were relying on speculation and insinuation, but the facts didn't support them. Then the moment came when I had to take the stand. I walked to the witness box with my heart pounding in my chest, my palms slick with sweat. I had never been in a courtroom before, and the idea of facing my parents directly, of speaking the truth about our family and our history, felt like an insurmountable challenge. But I had no choice now. This wasn't just about the house. It was about standing up for my relationship with my grandmother and my right to carry on her legacy. "Please state your name for the record," the judge asked. "I'm Emily Roberts," I said, my voice shaky but clear. The lawyer for my parents wasted no time. He launched into a series of questions meant to undermine my credibility. He asked about my relationship with Grandma, about how much time I had spent with her, and whether I had ever pressured her to make decisions in my favor. "Did your grandmother ever express doubt about her decision to leave you the mansion?" he asked, his eyes sharp and calculating. "No," I replied, my voice steady now. "Grandma knew what she was doing. We talked about the house many times, and she always told me that she wanted me to have it. It wasn't a decision made lightly. She was proud of the family legacy, and she trusted me to take care of it." The lawyer pressed further. "But you didn't think that maybe, just maybe, she was confused? After all, she was elderly, her health was failing, she wasn't in her right mind, was she?" I shook my head, feeling the sting of his words but standing firm. No, she wasn't confused. She was still sharp in her mind. She knew exactly what she was doing, and I would never do anything to pressure her. I loved her, and I respected her decisions. The lawyer's face grew red with frustration, but he had nothing more to say. It was clear that he was trying to manipulate the situation, but the truth was on my side. My grandmother had been of sound mind, and I had done nothing wrong. After what felt like hours, it was time for closing statements. Richard spoke first, summarizing the evidence we had presented and reminding the court that there was no proof of manipulation, no evidence of coercion, and no reason to doubt the validity of the will. He emphasized that my grandmother's decision was clear and that the will should stand. Then the other side had their turn. My parents' lawyer tried to argue that even if Grandma had been of sound mind, she might have been too easily influenced by me, but it was weak, hollow rhetoric that didn't hold up under scrutiny. Finally, it was over. The judge called for a recess before delivering his verdict, and we were all asked to leave the courtroom. My heart thudded in my chest, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. This wasn't just about legalities. It was about my family, my future, and everything I had fought for. I had never wanted to go to court, never wanted to be in opposition to my parents. But now, it was too late. The battle had been fought, and all I could do was wait. The recess felt like an eternity. My parents didn't speak to me, and I didn't know whether I should even attempt to say something to them. It seemed that whatever remained of our relationship had already been shattered. I sat with my thoughts, replaying every moment of the hearing in my mind, wondering if I had done enough, if I had made the right decisions. When we finally returned to the courtroom, the judge looked tired but resolute. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. After careful consideration of all the evidence presented, he began, "I find no sufficient reason to contest the validity of the will. There is no proof of undue influence or manipulation. Therefore, the will is to be upheld." My heart soared. The tension I had been holding in my body for months finally released, and I felt as though I could breathe again. The mansion, my grandmother's legacy, would remain with me. My parents had lost. But as the judge declared his final decision, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. The mansion was mine, yes, but the fight had cost me more than just legal battles. It had cost me my relationship with my parents. The divide between us was now irreparable. My mother didn't even look at me as we left the courtroom, and my father's eyes were cold, full of disappointment and anger. In the months that followed, life began to settle back into a new normal, but it wasn't the same. I kept the mansion, of course. I had no intention of selling it, and I spent countless hours restoring it, breathing life back into the rooms and halls that had once felt so full of warmth. But I knew that I had lost something far more important than property. My family was fractured, and there was no going back. As I stood in the grand entryway of the mansion one evening, looking at the fading light outside, I realized that the house was more than just a structure of brick and wood. It was a place where memories lived, where history was made. And although the legal battle was over, the real work, the work of rebuilding my life and finding peace, had only just begun.